Getting up in the morning is easy because you go to bed with all your clothing on. You slide out of the sleeping bag. The only thing you have to put on is the footwear. Here's a picture that I very often have used in my lectures to simply make a statement about some of the wonderful things you can do out there. Here we are eating breakfast at 13 below zero. Put a lantern inside the igloo and it glows like this orb out there. As we're getting ready to break up from the class, here's all of the students on top of an igloo. Everything will fit in a backpack and you can travel across country if you need to. Through the years, we had been experimenting with different ways of putting it together and different kind of styles, if you will, realizing that it was still ugly. But my attitude is style is being warm at 40 below zero, no matter what it looks like. From 1984 through 1990, I would call that the scientific and commercialization era. In 1984, Boy Scouts of America published part of the story of the foam clothing and the PALS clothing in their field book. While being interviewed by a group of newspaper writers and editors, and I was talking about the idea of no fire, no shelter, your clothing self-dries. If you get wet, you're going to be okay, and it'll dry out. The colder it is, the faster it dries. All these very unusual things. In fact, no waterproofing. You don't use waterproofing. So this was going against what they normally heard. And they said, does that really work that way? And of course I said it did. And after a little while of discussion, it came down to they gave me a challenge, which was to prove just how well I could survive if I got wet. Now, I didn't have any idea about what they were going to challenge me to do. The editor-in-chief told me, he said, Jim, I want you to go to one of our frozen lakes, chop a hole in the ice, take your funny, homemade, non-waterproof clothing, let yourself down in the hole in the ice, get yourself completely wet, do not change clothing, no fire, no shelter, and spend the night. Would you do that? And I said, okay. He asked me, have you ever done that before? And I said, well, is that normal human behavior? We agreed it was not. I mean, that's crazy. I'd never thought about doing that. I've been wet before, but not by that means. The other part of that story is this. He looked at me and he said, that's amazing. We'd love to do a story on you. And he said, by the way, it'll be a good story, and it doesn't make any difference whether you live or die. And I said, thank you, I think. Anyway, that's what we did. There's 18 inches of ice on this lake. The water temperature, of course, is 32 degrees in contact with the ice. And I simply crawled down inside of that with this clothing. Now, I got to tell you this. This is not fun. This hurts like blue blazes. When that 32-degree water runs up against your skin, it's extremely unpleasant. I slipped down into that hole in the ice, laid back in it, and did my best to enjoy myself. I spent 15 minutes in there. I drove myself into hypothermia. I was in very serious pain, doing my best here to look casual and smile, but really it's more of a grimace. Came out of that hole in the ice. Now, if the water will run in, it'll run out. The only thing I knew to do, because I hadn't done this before, is squeeze the water out. So I squatted down, I patted down, I squeegeed down every way I could to get the water out of there, and then just went active, which simply means walk and move. And I had camp activities because I'm going to spend the night out there. Now, I'm not a SEAL, and I'm not going to curl up beside that hole in the ice in just my clothing that I went through the hole. You see, nighttime clothing is called a sleeping bag. Now, I'm not taking that clothing off because you don't take that clothing off the way that we do it. When it's wet, you leave it on, you take it to bed because, see, the sleeping bag, being made the same way the clothing is, it'll handle the moisture. And that's exactly what I did. Later on that night, after it got dark and it was time to go to bed, I simply went to bed as I normally would. My clothing was still very damp, in some areas quite wet. In the night, as a matter of fact, in the night it wasn't all that pleasant because it was like sleeping in a steam bath. But through the night, my clothing dried, and by morning, there was only a slight dampness in my clothing. After I got up and moved around a little bit more, my clothing went completely dry. The sleeping bag is now damp. You sleep in the sleeping bag one more night, and it goes completely dry. I don't know of any other way to do this. And if you had done that with traditional clothing and traditional sleeping bags, it would be dangerous, if not downright deadly. This has performance that you can find no place else. Now, there was obviously some articles that were written about that, and it started legends, if you will. I know where legends come from, and I won't claim part of what went on. However, this caught enough attention of people that I was invited back to the Washington, D.C. area to meet with a number of retired generals who were very interested in helping the military stay warm. I met with some fabulous people back there. They gave me the challenge of making something that was a little more normal looking and a little more military looking. So I set up a little sewing operation in my garage and began the process of figuring out how to do this. We put together some clothing that looked pretty good. As a matter of fact, it worked extraordinarily well. What we then needed was a major industrial partner that could help take this to the world, not just to the military, but to industrial, commercial, and recreation markets, and that was going to take a lot of money and a lot of effort. Through our contacts, we were introduced to Burlington Industries, who at that time was looking for some new technologies and some new markets to penetrate. We were at the right place at the right time. I spent many hours at corporate headquarters and at the research facilities, giving them a complete rundown on the technology, how and why it worked the best we understood it, and what it would do and what it would not do. As a part of their due diligence, they, shall I say, volunteered one of their senior research scientists, Dr. Vince Ambrosiani, to come out to Utah and in January, which was just a few weeks away from our meetings in January, come out and go snow camping with me. Now, they thought he was a very good choice because, number one, he had never snow camped in all of his life, and he announced that he always had cold, sweaty feet all year round, so we figured, well, if we take care of him, we can take care of anybody. Vince came out in the first part of January. We went up into the mountains, and he spent the 2 days and a night out there where the nighttime temperature was only 5 below zero. But I remember him sitting in the kitchen the next morning as he was just pondering this. He got real quiet for a little while. He looked at me and he said, Jim, he says, I don't understand. I said, well, what don't you understand? He says, I don't understand what everybody talks about, cold and wet and miserable and being in the snow. He said, what are they talking about? And I looked at him and I said, tell you what, Vince, we'll go back to my house. We'll take off this clothing and I'll put on the conventional layering stuff that they use. We'll come back up here and spend another night. He looked at me and said, I get it. It's all about the clothing. Based on his reports, we then went forward with the project to do further research and development. As a result of that, over the next 2 years, I flew more than 1 million miles in the U.S. and Canada, giving briefings and doing presentations as well as all the research that we had to do. As we're getting started with the project, I told them one of the things I wanted to do was get some new data, get real data. Because you see, we'd been going camping and doing these things and just saying, well, this is how I feel. But I wanted to be able to measure it. We had a budget. We could get instrumentation. So we went above the Arctic Circle, about 1,000 miles north of the Arctic Circle, at Resolute Bay in the Northwest Territories. And we were going to set up camp for 3 weeks. We have thermocouples taped all over our body. We have several different sets of clothing we're going to rotate through. Some of our PALS clothing made different ways, as well as conventional clothing and layered clothing from other people, including the military's EQUEX system, which is the layers of polypropylene, fleece, and Gore-Tex. We're going to be using that also. So we build our camp. The individual on the left is wearing a layered system made by Patagonia. He has these thermocouples on his body. He's reading temperatures, and they're being logged by the individual on the right. Here's an indication of just how well it's going. Take a look at the person on the left. He's got his hands in his armpits. That's because his hands are cold. The reason his hands are cold is not just because the handwear is inadequate, but because his whole body is being chilled, and he doesn't have full blood supply into his hands, and so they get chilly. The person on the right, dressed in PALS, has almost no insulation on his hands. He has a very thin anti-contact glove, so he won't stick to things. The temperatures are below zero. And he has essentially bare hands out there because he has a warm core and he has full circulation of blood into his fingers. I'm wearing the EQUEX system. On my feet is the vapor barrier boot, sometimes called the bunny boot, with thermocouples taped on my toes. And then you can see how we can take the readings even with the footwear on. On the upper part of the body, here's where thermocouples break out, so you can take those readings. But the data tells it all, and this was so important for us to have because we learned things we hadn't been able to see before. During the first 4 days, I'm wearing the EQUEX system, and then I changed into the PALS system. Take a look at the top graph up there, that yellow one, and you can see that it starts to go down after the third, the fourth day. It's really taking a dip. That's a shoulder temperature up around behind where you don't have a lot of venting. Next graph shows the foot temperature, the green line with the big spikes up and down. And E, by the way, stands for exercise. And notice that the foot temperature is going down and down and down, even the peaks. That lowest E down there, That was after a 5-mile hike uphill. I could get my feet warmed up to almost 60 degrees for a high. And by the way, that's still pain. The next graph shows it all because that top blue line, that is core temperature. And you see that core temperature is going down, which means that all the temperatures are going down, and especially the extremities are freezing out. And oh, by the way, I was wearing Equex during the warmest period. At the beginning of the 5th day, I took off the Equex system and I put on PALS. As a matter of fact, I needed to get it off because if I had had to stay in it, in that environment, living outside, pretty soon my core temperature was going to match the outside air temperature, and that's not a good idea. I put the PALS system on, and all of my temperatures immediately rebounded, particularly the core temperature, and I was normal the rest of the trip. The other thing that's almost humorous is, you see, we're supposed to rotate through this clothing system. Each one of us tried the different ones, and I said, okay, who's next? Who's going to wear this? And both of those guys looked at me, and they said, we're not. We saw what happened to you, so I'm the only one that wore it up there. We were interested in the moisture accumulation in the clothing and in the sleeping systems, so we had scales and ways of measuring it up there, and this is what we found. The traditional fiber-filled bags, we had very, very expensive super below-zero sleeping bags as well as down bags, and then we had our simple homemade PALS sleeping bags made the way the clothing is. This is what we discovered. The PALS sleeping bag was slept in 21 nights. It had accumulated during that trip just about 8 ounces of water. Now, what we did was, when we left up there, we took everything, we double bagged it into large garbage bags, hauled everything back home, took it out, weighed everything, and then allowed things to dry completely, weighed them again so you could see how much water was in them. The fiber-filled bag that we had up there had only been slept in 8 nights, and it had accumulated almost 9 pounds of water, which means that probably by the 9th or 10th night out there, it was going to turn into an absolute ice cube, and you would be miserable in it. We had the opportunity to use some of the Inuit clothing so we could have a comparison with what we were doing. There was a lot of testing that went on, some of them inside of chambers, such as here, where I'm sitting sedentary with thermocouples on my body, taking readings, with my face in a fan where it can blow to see how well the hood seals up, laying down, being inactive, taking naps, outside, sleeping outside without sleeping bags. We built our own cold box to test footwear in. Here's thermocouples on the feet. You'd sit inside of a warm room with your legs going down in these insulated leggings, and of course you have boots on your feet. You could have one boot on one foot, another kind of boot on the other foot, and then measure the performance right then and there. It was a very effective way of doing it, and we typically ran that cold box at about 30 below zero. You simply lift up the skirt, you can stand up and then step up out of the box, and here, just after exiting, you can see the frost that's forming all over those boots because of the very cold temperatures that they were exposed to. Many times I would sit in my office working on the computer while I had my feet in the box logging temperatures, and if you'll notice on the 1 foot, the cold foot here, it's 51.3 degrees, and I've got to tell you, that is pain. Testing was done by others also. We went to Kansas State University, where a team there would evaluate the clothing and its performance. Here we are dressing a mannequin, putting the clothing on it, getting it ready for the testing, and then the chamber is closed up, and it was both on mannequins as well as live people doing different kinds of industrial tasks to determine how well the clothing would work. We also had to learn how to test materials. Air permeability is one of the things that you need to know, and the other one is the moisture vapor transfer rate and how to get those at their optimum values. Not only was testing done in chambers and in the laboratory, but also in the field. This is Mount Washington, New Hampshire in January, one of the coldest and windiest places that you can get at in the, shall we say, the civilized world. At this particular time, it's 13 below zero, and I'm leaning into 110 mile an hour wind. I spent 3 days out on the mountain. I slept out there all the time. I went to Mount Washington to test some of the features of the equipment to be sure we had them right. And as a result of that, when I came back, we made adjustments and some improvements to it. That's the reason you go.